Let us formally begin for today. Again, a hearty welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our series on America and the Holocaust, a series of colloquies. Thank you to our partners for today's events, Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial and Resource and Education Center of Florida. In each of these sessions, Dr. Michael Berenbaum will explore the complicated debate surrounding America and the Holocaust. Each session will feature a scholar whose work will shed new light on the topic and challenge us to reframe our understanding of the complex portrait of national inaction. Today's session will feature a discussion surrounding Nazis in Copley Square with Father Charles Gallagher. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. We offer unique travel study experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. We do this all through an authentic exploration into a complex narrative, engaging with scholars, fellow educators, experts, and contemporary witnesses, with the primary focus being the importance that historical place plays on our shared history. We are thankful for all your support over these past years, and most especially the past 3 years of navigating our expanded presence for CWB, while also supporting our robust offerings. Over these past 3 years alone, we've offered over 440 virtual programs with close to 75,000 participants, reaching almost 60 countries and most of the states in the United States. If you'd like to make a donation to support our organization, I will drop in the chat that link for you in just a moment. But before that, I have the pleasure of introducing today's guests. Dr. Michael Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and historical films. He is the director of the Ziggy Zaring Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, where he is also a professor of Jewish studies. Father Gallagher is a professor of history at Boston College who has written an important book about the Nazi activities, German and American Nazi activities in Boston. It is a major study of how German government officials and Nazi allies in America, most especially the German American Bund, worked in tandem to try to undermine the U.S. support for Britain and the Jews to strengthen American isolationism in the crucial pre-war years. Please send all your questions directly to Michael in the chat. We will try our best to answer them all. And with that, Michael and Father Gallagher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you again. And I'm very happy to be with my colleague and friend, Charles Gallagher, who's a Jesuit priest and a professor of history, and who's written quite an important book, which with real implications. I don't see you on my screen, Father Gallagher, so I'm going to ask you to make sure that you're unmuted, and also that your picture is on. All of a sudden, I've lost you for some reason. Ellen, do you have him?
Let me see in the list of participants if he is there. No, it looks like he maybe lost connectivity.
It looks like he lost connectivity.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna begin by saying that Father, I'm gonna call him Charlie because we're friends and we're comfortable with that. So let's keep it informal. He's written a book that has vast implications for understanding what was happening in the United States, because we often think of indifference and silence and reticence and reluctance and bystanders, but we don't pursue the question of who was supporting the Nazis, what was the engagement and the involvement of the German government, most especially until 1941. And remember, we had diplomatic relations with Germany until December 11th, 1941, because only then did Germany declare war on the United States. And what was the involvement and the engagement of the German American Bund and that community? And what makes Charlie Gallagher's writing even more important is he confronts the undercurrents in Christianity, most especially in the Roman Catholic Church, that were really supporting these efforts, and participating with them. So once you begin to say that, he's given us a very different portrait of what was happening in America. And he's talking about active collaboration with Nazi enterprise and active opposition to the United States getting into the war, the United States supporting Great Britain, and number two, doing anything particular in any way about the Jews. And what also makes it intriguing is we have exactly the same phenomenon taking place in Los Angeles, which suggests that one of the important areas of research that has to be done is the way, precisely what Charlie Gallagher has done, and that is the way in which each community had its own dynamics with regard to opposition to American support for Britain, and secondly, equally important, opposition to doing anything about the Jews. Charlie, I've been speaking about you behind your back, but I haven't said anything too inappropriate yet. So let me suggest that you unmute yourself, because at least the way I see you, you're muted. And let me ask you, why did you write the book? And then I want you to take us through the book.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Michael. It's a real honor to be here with you, Classrooms Without Borders.
Well, the honor really is to be with the teachers and to be with the people who are listening. And I know many of the names on the list, so we have a very distinguished audience who are anxious to hear all about it.
Absolutely, and I know the setup here at my university just went down for a moment, so I have a backup computer to the side of me right now. So I think in answer to your question, there's, as in many of these things that academics do, there's a personal reason and a professional reason. I'll start with the professional reason. The professional reason was that starting back in graduate school, when I was doing a master's, I did my master's at Binghamton University. I was a pretty devout Catholic kid, went to the local Catholic high school in Binghamton, and I wanted to study American Catholic history. And I studied American Catholic history under a rabbi in the religious studies department at Binghamton University, Rabbi Lance J. Sussman. And Rabbi Sussman was very influential.
I know Lance well.
Yeah, so he was influential on my intellectual life because he has devoted his craft, his life to American Jewish history. And so the two of us got along extremely well. And Lance Sussman, a brilliant scholar and incredible leader and rabbi. And so he was kind of a model for me. It's kind of interesting that like the Jesuit, the kid who's going to become a Jesuit someday actually is working with a rabbi in this kind of area of intellectual life. And so I did a lot of work on American Catholicism with Lance. And he came to me one day and he said, finally, I can only lead you so far. You really kind of need to kind of do this in a more Catholic setting. So I ended up going back to my alma mater, Marquette, and doing my PhD there. So the first book that I published about 10 years ago, almost 12 years ago now, was a study of Vatican diplomacy during World War II and the Cold War. And when I was putting that dissertation together, this group, the Christian Front, kept popping up. And at the same time, I was, I had these personal reasons to be more interested, particularly in the Christian Front. I had the duty to clean out the cellar of our house one day, and my dad had put all of his father's boxes of material down there, and I found a scrapbook that my grandfather had kept. And scrapbooks back in the 1930s were the equivalent of Facebook today. And there were a number of articles from Father Coughlin's newspaper. He wasn't a follower of Father Coughlin, but Father Coughlin is an anti-Semitic priest who becomes the religious inspiration for the Christian Front. And there was one article there that I remember seeing in my grandfather's scrapbook about the FBI basically coming down and doing a raid on the Christian Front headquarters in New York, and that really struck me. And then as I kept further researching in this area of Vatican diplomacy, even when I went over to the Vatican and did archives in the Vatican secret archives, I kept finding tidbits and reports about this group, the Christian Front. It had been neglected for 85 years. No one had wanted to write about it. No one had thought to write about it. No one had kind of picked up the scent of who this group was. And I just kept finding them popping up in various places where they would be influencing public life. And then in the behind the scenes record keeping and the behind the scenes in the archives, they never seemed to go away. And so I thought, gee, I think there's something there, and I'd like to write about them. The thing that interested me was they were authentically Catholic, and yet they wanted to overthrow the government. And they were working with fascists and Nazis. And I couldn't figure out why folks didn't find this interesting. Well, there are a couple of reasons. The American church wanted to actually, after the episode was over with, bury it. And then the U.S. government, the U.S. government, who was prosecuting the Department of Justice, they actually mishandled the case. And so they wanted to bury it. And so on both sides, both institutions decided it was best not to have anything happen about it. And then when I finally got the FBI file released in 2010, 2011, I suggested that the publisher of my first book help me publish this, and they said no. And the reason that they turned it down was the classic reason at that time, that the group didn't mount any tangible offensive. So they made bombs in their basement. Now, I thought that was very interesting. Why are they making bombs in their basements for religious purposes? In their view, they were doing it out of religion. But the bombs never were detonated, and bullets were never fired. And the equivalent of an attempt to overthrow the government never happened. And so it was all in the planning stages when the FBI moved in and had their raid. And so consequently, the historians who reviewed my proposal the first time said there's nothing here. And that was the classic answer for 75 years. There's no there. And so consequently, it wouldn't be worth a book. And I simply wouldn't give up. I mean, I was just tenacious. I thought basically, I just thought everybody was wrong about this. And I just kept digging, and I kept finding more and more stuff. In fact, the motivational part of actually getting the project underway was when I got turned down for publication the first time, when they said there was no there. It was a crisis because I was on tenure track as an academic, and I didn't have a book project. So I prayed. And the inspiration I got was just keep writing. And so I said, well, I'll just do this guy, Francis Moran, who I'll talk about in a little bit, who was the leader of the Christian Front in Boston. I thought to myself, well, no one has written anything on him, and I'll just write an article for the New England Quarterly about that guy. And then I started digging into who he was, and I found that he had secretly met with a Nazi SS officer in Boston in the summer of 1940. And I thought, holy cow, that's pretty amazing. And that's something no one knows about. And so that's when I started asking for his FBI file to be declassified. No one had written anything about him. No one had written anything about the Nazi he met with. I got that Nazi's FBI file released. I tracked down the Nazi in Boston's son, who was living in Frankfurt. I went to Frankfurt. I had 2 days of interviews with with the guy's son. It was really wild stuff. And I couldn't imagine. It was a whole new world that was opening up, and the internationalism and the fascism and the Nazism that was going on. Because I would walk around campus here at Boston College, and you're supposed to be a real egghead and talking about, and people say, what are you working on? And I would say, well, I'm working on Nazis in Boston, and everybody would laugh. I was like, and I kind of laughed too, because who would think it? And then and so I got a kick out of that, and I just kept kind of going with it, and it really worked out. And then there's also, because of my sensitivity to Catholic anti-Semitism, I was interested in pursuing it because I think that this issue about Father Coughlin, I always thought there had been enough books written on Father Coughlin, but not anything written on these, what I call foot soldiers. These were militants.
Let's say a word about Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was a Detroit-based priest who essentially had a very popular and very influential radio program. And I want our teachers to remember that radio was then the advanced medium of communication. So if you had a radio program, this was terribly important. And he had a wide following. He was a rabid anti-Semitism and a very important isolationist. And in fact, the irony is one of the best treatments of this happens in fiction, which is Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which imagines that Franklin Delano Roosevelt either did not run for a third term or was defeated by Charles Lindbergh, and consequently, the whole nature of what the United States was about was transformed. Take us through your book a little bit, because you have an interesting PowerPoint. And then we'll continue talking. I'm going to also raise something now, just to keep our teachers a little bit intrigued, which is, and give you a little bit of time, since you know what the PowerPoint's going to be, give a little bit of time of prepare. Are we experiencing a little bit of what Yogi Berra, you're a Bostonian, so I can talk about the New York Yankees, what Yogi Berra would call deja vu all over again? Do we have these types of forces in the United States that are subterranean and not yet ready to come out, or are coming out in their own particular way? But I don't want to address that now. I want to raise that for the future, but toward the end. But please take us through your book, Charlie.
Okay, so I'm gonna share screen now, and then let me see here. I'm gonna go to bring up my PowerPoint, and this is a little PowerPoint that I put together for today. Now I've got a number of slides. I'm just going to fly through these, so it's going to be kind of a visual slideshow that'll whiz by. This is not the cover of the book. It was one of the proposed covers of the book. And here we are with Classrooms Without Borders. Again, this is the origin story. The first book was that Vatican Secret Diplomacy. That's where they kept popping up. And then here's just kind of a something about why it wasn't written, because there was a consensus within the community of scholars that, and this is a letter from 1939 about a fellow Nazi agent along with Moran, and because they were so far to the right, a lot of liberal historians, the consensus was, we don't want to write about these people because to write about them in an academic way gives them credence. And so for a long time in the profession, for example, when I was in graduate school, it would be very difficult for me to do a thesis on the Christian front because of this attitude. And that was also partly the attitude why the book got turned down. But then when Trump was elected in 2016, you have this other narrative that comes to the fore. This is an article by Rick Perlstein that was front of the New York Times Magazine, saying that precisely because of that attitude that historians have neglected the right, and that we don't have a full history of the ideas of the right wing. And he says that these are some of the reasons why, there's at least one reason why Trump may have been elected, is that those ideas never went away. And so in this article in the New York Times Magazine, April of 2017, he called for a synthetic book, a monograph about the Christian Front, which I was then proposing to the press there. This is a copy of the cover of the book. Nazis of Copley Square doesn't make sense to people in a lot of ways, but this is the Nazi who was in Boston, Herbert Scholz. This is his agent, Francis P. Moran, who he recruited. Moran was running Father Coughlin's organization in Boston. That organization was called the Christian Front. Scholz is an SS officer and an intelligence expert. He recruits Moran, and this is a relationship that has been hidden since the book was published in 2021. So for over 80 years, people had no idea that Moran was a Nazi spy, basically, and doing that work. The Copley Square Hotel is where the Christian Front had their headquarters. That's a small hotel in Back Bay, Boston.
For 1 second, just many of our audience, many of our teachers here are not from Boston. As you can imagine, some are even from Pittsburgh, where ironically today the Tree of Life trial is going on.
Right.
Take us to what Copley Square is in Boston. You said it's adjacent to Back Bay, but how prominent a spot is that in Boston?
Copley Square is the primary tourist spot in Boston. It's the most affluent area of Boston that's commercial, and it's where the Boston Public Library is located. It's where Trinity Church is located. It's where all the best hotels are located. The Fairmont Copley is there. The Ritz-Carlton is there. It's a few blocks from the Public Garden. It's the epicenter of Boston, and it's a very, very prestigious address.
Right. Okay, let's continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So again, I'm just going to fly through these. What I want to do in the book, there's a picture of Father Coughlin speaking. What I wanted to do in the book was to talk about how theologians influenced this organization. What I wanted to do was to, in my view, people who had written about Father Coughlin and the Christian Front were all political historians. And in my view, you can't get people to act asymmetrically or kind of in unorthodox ways without religion as a motivating factor. And I thought the political historians only focused on the politics of it, but not the religious part of it. And I've always thought that the motivational part is the religion. And if you can skew the religion, or if you can mangle the religion in such a way as to force action, then that's where the rubber meets the road. And so in my book, I wanted to show that this group that called themselves the Christian Front, the newspapers of the day, the historians of the day, and the historian since never took them seriously as a religious group. And I thought that was a mistake. And so when I wrote the book, that's what I talked about. Here's Coughlin's a priest. He's preaching a message that's not authentic Christianity. In fact, it violates the law of love, but he's couching it in religious phraseology. And that's what I wanted to do with the book, was to kind of bring in a discussion about theology and how these people use theology in order to meet their own ends. So here's another theologian, Paul Tillich, wrote about the Christian Front. Tillich's one of the most famous Protestant theologians of the 20th century. So again, these are just there are a number of Catholic priests who are involved in here. Priests, again, that no one has ever heard of or have been written about, but I started to uncover who they were and track their influence on this group. This is another reason. These are the isms and the theologies that I think were kind of influencing the rise of the organization. Catholic action was a theological principle, mystical body of Christ theology. All of these were used by Christian Front leadership to kind of push their members towards very asymmetric, anti-Semitic positions. That's the thing. The real driver in all this for Catholics was anti-Semitism.
Let me only interrupt for one moment. I'm a rabbi, and give me a 30-second definition of the mystical body of Christ theology. Actually, we'll give you 2 minutes because I would bet that most of our listeners have no idea what that means.
Absolutely. So this is a theology based in the writings of St. Paul, where in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul writes that any action which is detrimental to the part is detrimental to the whole. And the whole of the Christian community is the baptized community of Christ. And all baptized Christians are members of what is called in the 1930s the mystical body of Christ. So that if a Catholic community in Barcelona is harmed in a physical way, that harm is felt in Boston. And the reason I focus on this is because this is a new theology that's coming to prominence in the 20s and 30s. And I think it has everything to do with how communist governments, when they attack nationalists who are largely Catholics and Christians, this is where the Catholic anti-communism starts to arise, and the association is made between communism and Judaism as symbiotic. And so these Catholics who are being persecuted across the globe, Mexico in the 20s and Spain in the 1930s in particular, this theology helps Catholics around the world to have an understanding that the persecution of Catholics in these other parts of the globe is a persecution of themselves and a persecution of what's known as the mystical body of Christ, of which they are all members. My view, that sort of theology dissipates borders, and it becomes a transnational theology, and it leads to a larger cohesion, particularly when connected to a grievance claim by Catholics. And so that's why I write about it in the book. Now, no one had ever done that before, but I thought, that's what I came up with. That's what I saw happening. So that's what I went with. And I wanted to talk about it as a theological movement as well as a political movement. But here you see the Christian Front members with their Springfield 1903 rifles. Those are military grade weapons, which they purchased legally through the National Rifle Association. If you were a member of the National Rifle Association in the 1930s, you could send your number, your NRA number, to the War Department and request to get a military rifle sent to your local armory at first, and then you could have it shipped to your doorstep for about $7.50. Now, those are weapons of war. It was thoroughly legal to buy them. This is a photograph of Christian Front members at target practice at their rifle range training. It was an ingenious way to cache weapons. They were also able to get expended older shells from World War I sent to them, and they used the cordite from those shells to make bombs. And in the basement, as I mentioned before, they were using theology to attempt to overthrow the government. They used St. Thomas Aquinas on the notion of tyranny, to say that they felt that Roosevelt was peppering his administration with communists, or with Jews, I should say, with Jews, and they didn't see Jews as Jews. They saw American Jew, any Jew, and not just American Jews, as communists. And so they felt that the Roosevelt administration was rapidly becoming a communist government in the United States. And they felt that they needed to overthrow that government and cleanse it of its its communist Judaic foundations. So here's just some more graphics on that. This is the commander in New York City, a guy named John F. Cassidy, a bit of a very aggressive, very militant leader. You can read about him in the book. He's kind of a fascinating character. Again, he's a street level organizer. These are right-wing fascists, right-wing pro-Nazis who no one has written about before. He's very aggressive, very anti-Semitic. And I felt that these people were worthy of writing about, like that we had to know who they were, because this is where the energy comes from that brings about the high level of not only anti-Semitism philosophically, but the violence directed against Jews at the time in the United States. And I'll get to more to that. This is kind of the sad commentary of the book, is it's really a chronicle of not just Catholic anti-Semitism, but what I call paramilitary anti-Semitism. These dudes wanted to do harm, and as we'll see later, move towards exterminationism. And that's where the connection, I think, to the Holocaust comes in, that the ideas that brought us the Holocaust are really present in this group. And they may not have been present exactly at the beginning, but they grow and metastasize as the movement gains steam in the United States, and as the U.S. government is unable to really reel it in and actually make any inroads with discovering that as it moves to Boston, it's being controlled by the Nazis. And then after 1942, when it goes underground, it becomes even more insidious.
Yeah, let's just recall, after 1942, we're at war with Germany.
Right.
And cooperating with Germany is nothing less than treason.
Yeah, so it's punishable under the Espionage Act of 1917, the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. I mean, Moran should have gone to jail for a long, long time, and that never happened. In fact, these guys. So let me just run through here. This was all coast to coast news, front page news, coast to coast. That was another reason why I found it very strange that no historian had written about this group. It captivated me, but I just couldn't see why no one had kind of taken it up. So I look at it through the lens of paramilitarism and these other kind of things. Now, the other thing too is when I was 19, I joined the police force on my hometown. And so I was being trained in semi-automatic weaponry and on shotguns and stuff. So I kind of knew a little bit about guns. So I was probably the only historian that was looking at these people that actually knew what the guns were that they were holding. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're kind of huge. You know, a Springfield 1903, one of those shells, it holds about 5 rounds in the magazine. But one of those bullets, a 30-06 bullet, will go through I've seen a 30-06 bullet go through a cinder block, not just a brick wall, but a cinder block wall. So they get off because you can read about it in the book, but the Justice Department stumbles and fumbles their way through this prosecution. The thing is, they use the sedition charge as the way to get headlines, and it's the publicity charge. The DOJ thought that they had stolen all of their weapons from U.S. armories, National Guard armories. And each theft of a weapon from an armory carries a 35-year sentence. So the government was convinced that they would put all of these jokers away for centuries. But they didn't know that if you were a member of the National Rifle Association, you could write to the War Department and receive a rifle in the mail. They had no idea about that. J. Edgar Hoover the director of the FBI didn't know anything about that, and the government didn't know anything about that. So they got off. And then after New York, that was happening in New York. After the New York trial they were generally acquitted, they decided to shut down the operation in New York because there was too much publicity there, and everything moved to Boston. And so we end up in Boston in 1940 with this guy, Francis P. Moran, who is at that time Father Coughlin's lieutenant of the Christian Front in Boston, and he's calling the shots now. And he is a very very active organizer and very excellent public speaker. He's a dropout from a Catholic seminary. And he's actually a very smart guy. And at the same time, in late 1938, Herbert Scholz comes to Boston to serve under diplomatic cover as the consul in Boston. And this is his pedigree, this guy Scholz, that no one has written about before. He was mentored by Heinrich Himmler, who was the architect of the Holocaust. His first job was as secretary to Rudolf Hess, who was the deputy Führer to Hitler. He worked in the Brown House, which was the Nazi Party headquarters. He worked on the second floor for almost 2.5 years in the early 1930s, every day. And on the first floor, guess who had his offices? None other than Adolf Hitler. So he was very close with the kind of the pantheon of henchmen, if you will, of the Holocaust.
Now, was he assigned to Boston because the operation had moved to Boston, or he organized the operation?
He was assigned to Boston because they needed a heavy in Boston. This is a photo of Karl Wolff, who Scholz will serve with after he leaves Boston. He'll be the aide de camp to Wolff, who's the highest ranking SS general. But there's a reason he comes to Boston. This is a statement from Wolff about Scholz. He represents the straight line of the SS. That's a character reference from.
Right.
So this is the reason he comes. In the press, what was made true in the press was that Scholz had made a faux pas diplomatically when he had been assigned for a short time to the Washington embassy, the German embassy in Washington. So what was made true in the press was that he was demoted from the embassy in Washington and sent to be consul in Boston as a demotion. But what was actually true was that this man you see here, Heinrich Brüning, was the last real chancellor of Germany, the last substantial chancellor of the Weimar Republic. And he became a nemesis of Hitler's in a lot of ways. And he took a position in 1937. He had to leave Germany by the skin of his teeth, the Gestapo on his heels. He took a job teaching in the political science department at Harvard. And after Kristallnacht in November of 1938, he decided to break his silence and make anti-Hitler speeches from Harvard and other places on the East Coast. And it was then that Himmler decided to send a heavy to Boston. And in the book, you can read about the intimidation campaign that Scholz ran against Brüning. It's rather chilling, frightening. It's all that you would expect from a Nazi. But on the face of it, this is Scholz. He's known as Handsome Herbert in the diplomatic corps. He's very genteel. He has a beautiful wife, the beautiful Lieselette von Schnitzler. And he lives the high life. He comes from a fabulously wealthy Bavarian manufacturing family, but he was a thoroughly Nazified believer. And you can read about his biography in the book. It's a rather fascinating biography. And also his wife here is an agent of her own right, helping him do his work. This is the consulate on Beacon Hill in Boston. That's 2 blocks away from the State House in Boston, and that's in the spring of that's in the summer of 1940. No, the spring of 1940, right after Hitler, the Nazis had rolled into Holland and the Low Countries. This is Scholz again at the picture taken at the consulate. It's hard to find him in his SS uniform. He was very coy about wearing that in public in the United States. That over on the other side is some stuff about his work with others and other Nazi agents in the United States. This is a slide about basically Scholz recruited Moran to try to get the U.S. Army to adopt a rifle that the Germans had come into possession of when they took over the Netherlands. This rifle is the first semi-automatic air-cooled rifle ever designed, and it's called the Johnson automatic rifle. The first country to buy that was the Netherlands. It is an amazing rifle because it's the first technology in semi-automatic weaponry that blurs the lines between semi-automatic and full auto. The only reason I mention that is that the same technology after the war was bought up by a company in California called Armalite. And they make a rifle that you know in the news now as the AR-15. The AR-15, AR does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for the first two letters of the Armalite Corporation. And that rifle was designed in Providence, Rhode Island in 1939, and Scholes and Moran operated a clandestine public relations scheme to try to pressure Congress to adopt that rifle, because the Germans were in possession of that rifle and they were not able to get the tech specs for the Garand rifle, which you see at the bottom. And consequently, they wanted to take the advantage on the battlefield. And what you see here is a religious organization, writing letters, picketing, giving meetings and speeches about how the U.S. Army needs to adopt one rifle over another. You can read about that in the book. This is the Senate Armed Services Committee looking at the rifles. You won't see that on the Senate floor anytime soon. But that's from 1940. That's when they were deliberating on what gun to adopt.
Charlie, we have to say hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. So these are some stats about where the Christian Front was. 1941, keep in mind, the FBI had arrested the New York group. They'd adjudicated a full trial against the New York group, but yet in early 1941, it has 30,000 members on the East Coast, all the way from Maine to Philadelphia through the tri-state area. And then you can see other things. You have 5 intelligence agencies, the U.S., that I've been able to track, who are surveilling the Christian Front. And the reason I mention that is 5, you can look at the number here and look at what they were. None of them, except for the Office of Naval Intelligence, none of them except for ONI. And ONI was pushed back on this. Washington wouldn't accept their assessment. But none of those intelligence agencies found out that Scholes was running Moran as a Nazi spy. None of them. The whole relationship went unknown until 2021. I think that's remarkable.
I also think it's quite remarkable. Let's Charlie, let's finish with this because I want you to respond to some.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're done here. There's a British intelligence operation that I could get into, but that is going to take, you can read about that in the book. It's not exactly something that is connected to the, well, it causes anti-Semitic riots in 1943 in Boston, but we can talk about that later.
So let's go through some of the questions.
Sure.
Do Christian evangelicals encompass Catholic anti-Semites, so their ideas and talking points the same? In one sense, I'd have to ask it in a larger way. Do we have continuity here on the extreme right?
So I think that there is a continuity that I have not written about it in this book, but I have talked about it elsewhere, that it's connected to the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, where Lenin and Trotsky's Red Army, as they move west, and keep in mind there's a war that everybody forgets about, that Lenin invaded Poland in 1920. It was a really brutal war. Everybody forgets about it. But as the Red Army moved towards Poland, both after the revolution and during the Civil War, they put Orthodox Christians to the test. And there were a number of American Christians in Russia at the time who later become fantastically right-wing over this issue. They saw the Red Army put Orthodox Christians to the bayonet, and the idea was they either recanted their faith or they were martyred for the faith. And a number of these Americans, William Dudley Pelley, who founds the Silver Shirts, he was a news reporter for the YMCA. And he saw this. He goes and forms a fascist organization by the mid-30s. A guy named George Detheridge, he also is another person that nobody knows about. He was in Russia at the time of the Civil War and saw what he called a persecution against Orthodox Christians, and saw that and deemed it that the Red Menace was actually not even a menace, but was out to exterminate Christianity. Detheridge has a huge career back in the States. Again, nobody knows about him, nobody's heard of him, but he's very influential in the mid-1930s. Also, Elizabeth Dilling, no one's ever heard of her, but she's in Russia at the same time, and she sees what she considers to be Christianity at the tip of a bayonet. And so she writes a best-selling novel in 1935 condemning Roosevelt as a communist, and it makes the New York Times bestseller list. And so these are people nobody knows, again, because it goes back to, why doesn't anybody want to write about the right wing? Well, there's a lot of reasons why they haven't done this history. And I think it's very important to have on record.
Now, we're asked by somebody, how active was the Christian Front in other cities like San Francisco, Chicago, etc.? I mentioned before, when you were hesitant, when your direct access collapsed here, I mentioned that we now have a book about a similar series of movements in Los Angeles, and in fact of a Jewish spy ring that infiltrated this group, a Jewish-led spy ring of Christians who infiltrated this group. Where were the height of activity? Was it San Francisco? Was it Chicago? Was it Detroit?
So, I mean, Laura Rosenzweig has written a really good book, Hollywood Spies. Stephen Ross has also written on this topic at USC. So the West Coast faction is the West Coast Jewish efforts to understand what was going on. What was, in my view, what was happening and what needs more work done on it is that after 1936, for diplomatic reasons, the Germans decided to put their intelligence function in their consulates. And the consul in San Francisco was a guy named Fritz Wiedemann. And Wiedemann was a longtime friend of Adolf Hitler. The two had served in the same regiment in World War I and served in the same trenches. And they'd known each other for a long time. Wiedemann was a very energetic spy master, and he has not been written about. And I think more needs to be done on that. And I think, what's happening is that
I have to tell you, I'm taking notes here, and I now know what 3 more dissertations I can recommend.
Yeah, and I think you can find the information out there. It's just that Canadian historians have done a good bit of work about espionage through the Canadian consulates, but the Americans haven't picked up that scent yet, and so I think that's the next.
We're asked by one of the teachers, how does Charles Lindbergh fit into the Christian Front?
Yeah, so Charles Lindbergh is
nominally Protestant, obviously.
Right. So the Christian Front members sympathize with what Lindbergh is doing, but there is no interplay between Lindbergh or the group that we've come to know as America First from that period. There's no interplay there. And my hypothesis is that Father Charles Coughlin was a megalomaniac, and he did not want to share power with anyone, be it a Lindbergh or be it anybody else on the right. And so when he formed the Christian Front, he formed it as his organization. And in the book, you'll read about how Coughlin danced around the issue of anti-Semitism. I can say, as the author of the book, that the Christian Front was thoroughly anti-Semitic, and that its leader, Francis Moran, moved towards exterminationism as the war went on. And by exterminationism, I mean the same level of judgment that brought us the Holocaust.
Let's go. We have a couple more questions that are fascinating. The question somebody just asked is that Milwaukee was restricted by the U.S. government because of the large number of German American population. What does your research reveal about the size of the German American population? And also, let me add to that, were these first generation German Americans, or had assimilation occurred with still a residue of allegiance to Germany? And I'm thinking, since I'm addressing Gallagher, I'm thinking of there is a strong residue of allegiance of the Irish American community, the homeland of Ireland. Witness our president going to Ireland a couple of weeks ago, and the homecoming, as it were, for him. Were these first generation? Were these second generation? What does that represent?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. The way I've conducted my research is that my hunch was that while the FBI was looking at first generation Germans and the Bund, it was so obvious that first generation Germans and the Bund would have been under surveillance for espionage, that they had not concluded that the consulates had become the epicenter of espionage. And they also did not have within their worldview the fact that an American like Moran, a first generation American, would ever spy against their country. Like they entirely underestimated German intelligence in the United States.
But it's interesting when you say that, because there was tremendous reticence up until the early years of 43 to accept German Jewish refugees to use that skill set who were home in German culture, who spoke the language fluently, who were vehemently anti-Nazi because of the condition of their parents and the like. There was a reluctance to use that resource. By the way, an interesting reluctance that we also saw later on in the total failure to use Iraqi expats. In our battle against Saddam Hussein. But German Jewish refugees, by the way, that included people like Henry Kissinger and the like, were not allowed to participate until much later, even though they could have been and would have been and should have been and were dramatically anti-Nazi. Let me ask because we're running short on time, and I know I'm speaking for everybody by saying we're going to have you back because this is fascinating material and this is new material. Let me ask and I'm going to date myself because I'm going to say, and the $64,000 question. One person asks, do you see similarities of what's been presented and what's going on today, mostly in the United States, but also perhaps in other countries?
Yeah, I do, because, and this is where I'll begin answering that. The issue that was most prominent in propelling these Catholics who called themselves the Christian Front, the issue that was most front and center for them was anti-communism. And what I find in the kind of populist nationalist wing of the political discourse is a growing lexicon, a growing conversation about a revival of communism, or kind of a communist style in American politics. And so that's where I see this. if I can share, for example, if I could just share the screen one more time, I have a slide that might make this more
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
more visual. And so I'm going to just go down here to one of my last slides. This is none other than our man who runs one of the most popular broadcasts on Rumble. Now, when he was taken off YouTube, he had 23 million listeners. That's Steve Bannon, of course. And if you look in the background, he all of a sudden got religion. But if you look at this imagery, you have a Celtic cross, you have the Madonna, and then you have a very pre-Vatican II, or in other words, pre-1960s, when the church modernized Jesus. I only show Bannon because I think Bannon is really one of the most prominent, full-throated anti-communists in the public sphere today. Now he's been deplatformed from YouTube, but I think his anti-communism, basically based in anti-CCP, Communist Chinese Party politics now, is extremely high quotient, and I think he would call himself an anti-communist, and he also calls himself a Catholic, right? So that's kind of the framing that I see happening in the fringe right political discourse. I just want to back up one slide and show your audience this a slide that is very chilling. This is from an FBI record, and this is an informant named Informant T1. And through today, we simply do not know who T1 is, because Informant T1 refused to go public and testify against Moran because they thought they would be killed. But this is a verbatim of what Moran said to T1 at one point. He wanted to get rid of every Jew overnight, and that this was something he planned to do after the war by enlisting returning veterans who knew how to handle a firearm into the Christian front. So that's what I meant by exterminationism. It was real. This is the style of anti-Semitism that brought us the Holocaust and effectuated the Holocaust, and it was operational in Boston, at least in this source. So I'll back out. I'll stop the share now, and we can go back to conversation.
Let me say that I follow a basic principle for a session to be immortal. It doesn't have to be eternal.
Mhm.
And I think the best thing to say is a very important four-letter word, which is more. But we and it's a clean word. I can say that to a priest. I can say that to an audience of teachers. And I think Ellen and Jackie, we will find a way to have you back.
Okay.
This has been a fascinating, frightening, and chilling hour. And number one, you know how deeply I appreciate your work. And I think that there will be a number of people here who are going to pick up the Nazis of Copley Square and really. But the most chilling part is the sense of their echoes today.
Mhm.
This is not only about the past, but their echoes today in the world in which we live.
Mhm.
So thank you very much, Father Gallagher. Thank you very much to the audience. And let me turn it back to Ellen, please.
Fantastic. And you have said our sentiments exactly. We absolutely need to bring you back, Father Gallagher. So many comments coming in the chat
Okay.
about the fascination of today's discussion. So many questions. We will certainly design a second session, a third session as needed to explore this topic in more detail. I did drop the book link in the chat earlier. I will be sure to include that in our follow-up email that also includes the recording to this event. I also want to alert everyone that all of our previous events can now be accessed on our website. You simply need to request membership, and then you can click through all of those past recordings. So you no longer need to request those recordings. We want to formally thank our partners for today's event, Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. We hope that you'll join us next month for the 5th session in this series on May 17th, featuring a conversation between Michael Berlin and Michael Berenbaum. As well as, of course, tomorrow, we have our 3rd in our 8-part series exploring the multifaceted discipline of Holocaust studies through uniquely and previously unexplored lenses. It is entitled Holocaust Tapestries. Tomorrow's session will be entitled Why Should We Care? The Holocaust and Public Humanities with Professor Bjorn Grodendorf. To sign up for these events and more, please visit our website at www.cwbpgh.org. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all again soon.